We grow when we give.
We grow when we give.
We grow when we give.
Nosotros crecemos cuando damos.
We grow when we give.
Давайте, и дастся вам.
与えるとき成長する.
We grow when we give.
Welcome to R.O.G, Return on Generosity. I'm your host, Shannon Cassidy. This podcast celebrates generosity at work, not financial giving valuable time, mutual respect, alternative perspectives, and genuine collaboration. In this first of 2 episodes, we are introduced to the amazing Amy Edmondson. She's written books, is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School. She's been on many podcasts and is a remarkable person. In this first episode, we get to know Amy, learn about her background, her mentor, and begin to unpack the remarkable thinking that she's developed on the topic of failure. Her most recent book is The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. In this episode, she explains the differences between mistakes and failures and provides criteria for smart failure. We will continue the conversation in episode 192. Please subscribe to R.O.G if you haven't already so you don't miss it. Here's Amy. Our special guest today is Dr. Amy Edmondson, the world's #1 ranked management thinking, the world's leading authority in psychological safety, and the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School. A multi-best-selling author, Amy's latest book that we will discuss today, titled Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. This book builds on her prior work on psychological safety and teaming. It provides a framework for thinking about, discussing, and practicing the science of failing well. It's an exceptional body of work. In fact, it won the Financial Times Business Book of the Year 2023. On a long list of things that I appreciate about you, Amy, generosity, intelligence, communication skills, long list. What I appreciate most is your grace. You are gracious when you disagree with others and when you clarify what you're saying. I'm just deeply honored to have this conversation, and welcome to R.O.G.
Thank you. That is the most gracious introduction I think I've ever had. So thank you. What a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. I mean it. I've been a student of yours for a long time. And one of yes, I learned the content that you share, but how you communicate is really exceptional. And it's just a great role modeling. So thank you for that. So I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit about your background.
Yeah, always. I will try not to make this our whole time together. But I grew up in New York City, and in sort of uptown Manhattan. My dad rode his bike to work every day. I would be ridden on the back way before we had those comfortable seats, to our parochial school and my brother on the front. I mean, it was terror, but it was great. Anyway, so I grew up in this kind of kooky family where my dad loved to cook, loved to ride his bike to work because it saved a quarter for the bus or whatever. Went to school. I was pretty good at school. Went to Harvard College, studied engineering. Wasn't really very good at it, but I wanted to show that I was as smart as my brother, which I was not. And then went off. Here's where the adventure begins. Went off to work for Buckminster Fuller, who was just a remarkable American visionary architect, inventor who was passionate about problem solving in ways that would help the world work for everyone. So that sounded like a pretty good mission to me. Now, I think his primary impact was really as an educator who changed how so many people thought, about their role in society, about their lives, about their kind of responsibilities. So he very much influenced me. He was in his 80s. He died. I wrote a book about his work, not a biography, a book about his work. And then I was wide open, sort of like, what do I do? And what am I good at? And make a long story short, I almost accidentally got a job in a boutique organization development consulting firm. And I loved it, right? I loved organizations and their challenges. And I found them to be full of really thoughtful people who were stuck, unable to make their giant corporations shift as they knew they needed to thrive in a changing world. Right? So this became of such great interest to me that I realized I sorely lacked the training and the education I needed to be as effective as I could be. And so I found myself 10 years after college applying to a PhD program. So I met some professors who said, yeah, this is what you should do. So I applied, and lo and behold, I got in, the first couple of years were a little rocky because I was, not just that I'd been out of school for a long time, but I was with people who had majored in psychology or business, and I know nothing, right? I'm just completely a neophyte and many years older than all of them. So it took me a while to get my footing and get my identity, as a researcher. But then all of a sudden, I kind of found my stride and realized this is great work. Like this kind of work is really great for someone like me. Like I like coming up with, what are the right questions to ask? And then what are the data one would need to answer that question? And what would be why might this matter? And how could we help people, practice differently and all this stuff? And so when I graduated from the PhD and I got a faculty job, a job as an assistant professor at Harvard Business School, I didn't think I'd get to stay here. I mean, I just thought, well, this is a great place to start. And, I won't get tenure, but that's okay because I'll learn a lot. I'll become a better teacher. I'll get some work done and life goes on. And lo and behold, 28 years later, I'm still here.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for that very brief walk through your history. A lot of it is in some of your other writing. So for people who want to dig in deeper, they can, but that was a really helpful background. And I know Buckminster Fuller is a major mentor and a influence on you. So we, get the benefit of his wisdom through your work.
He exuded curiosity. He just was, even in his mid 80s, he was just like genuinely curious about everything. And, even something as small as my running shoes. I mean, he was stunned by these Nike shoes I had because they were so lightweight. He was born in 1895, right? So he kind of went, wow, like this,
Yeah.
I remember thinking, it's just a pair of running shoes. But
yeah,
he had this joy.
But how did that influence you? Like, how did his curiosity spark yours?
Modeling, I really do think that leadership is part being a role model. And, when it's infectious, right? If someone's curious, you become more curious. And if someone is listening intently, you listen intently. And he was quite generous with credit and very joyful. And so that influenced me in the sense that, society kind of tells you that if you make it that long, you're going to be like unhappy. It's like, this is the happiest person I've ever met, so it made me sort of more hopeful, I think.
Yeah, he really modeled like a lot of these important characteristics and attributes, and he was also successful because I do think sometimes there's like an anti-prosperity type of messaging going on that you can either be good or wealthy.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it's funny, Bucky used to say, you have to make up your mind whether you're going to make money or make sense. And it wasn't that they're mutually exclusive, but which path you get on. Like if you deliberately set on the path to try to solve problems, the money will probably follow, at least enough of it. Whereas if you set on the path, okay, I just have to make money, you may succeed in making money, but you may find yourself somewhere you don't want to be.
So what was his counsel to you as a young professional?
I mean, it was essentially follow your nose. I mean, try to do good work, use your brain. You're here to use your brain to solve problems on behalf of others. I mean, it's that simple. Now, different ones of us have different problems. I'm not very good at solving technical problems, but I'm good at solving kind of people and organizational
team problems.
Problems.
Yeah, which some would argue those are more complicated. So when you just talked about how, you like coming up with the question and finding the data that we need, and then, how can we look at this differently and how might this make sense? I mean, that led you to this body of work that we've been talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about how this came into your life and, why did you decide to study mistakes and failure?
I decided to study mistakes and failures because I was really interested in learning. I mean, and specifically organizational learning, not human learning or individual learning, but because I was just perplexed and fascinated by the fact that these large corporations I had been spending time in had trouble shifting. Let's just say automotive, the big three had trouble shifting, even though the writing was loud and clear on the wall that smaller, more fuel efficient, higher quality cars were coming in and stealing market share by the day. And I thought, my initial stupid idea was they just don't know, right? But then I realized they know better than I, but it's hard to shift, right? So I thought, well, why is it so hard? And what is it, there's a lot of very sophisticated answers to that question of why it's hard, but at least one of them is, it's difficult to get human beings to change their behaviors in kind of productive ways. And so if you want to be, so I got fascinated by Peter Senge's learning, the fifth discipline and the learning organization and systems thinking. And I thought, if you want to be a learning organization, what does that mean, right? It doesn't mean individuals are learning. That's true, but absolutely inadequate. And then you can't step back and say, well, the organization's learning. Like, what does that mean? I mean, it's way too abstract. The organization doesn't even really exist. That's an abstraction. It's lots and lots of people and lots of departments and teams and so forth. And so I came to the idea that the team is really the unit of learning in organizations. And that means, the top management team is learning about the market environments and the technological changes and making strategic bets on what's going to work. But that is the product of high quality conversations and, to some extent, mistakes and failures and understanding them. Meanwhile, you've got teams doing product development. They have to be learning. You have teams on the front line doing Kaizen and continuous improvement. They're learning, right? So it's like, okay, every team has to learn, but they're learning different things in different ways. So again, that's still a little too abstract. So I got invited to, but in that story, in that thinking, was always that mistakes and failures, and those aren't the same thing, are part of the curriculum. Right? They're part of what we must learn from. And so when I was invited as a early stage graduate student to study, because they needed help from some kind of social psychologist to study medication errors in hospitals, it's like, well, yeah, that seems like a good place to study organizational learning, because it's clear that the goal is to reduce medication errors and reduce patient harm. And it's clear we don't know enough about how to do that. So I said, yes, I'm going to help with that. And I can't say that I made a huge contribution to that question, but what I did find by accident was that people even in the same hospital systems have extraordinarily different tolerances for speaking up about error. And that was the sort of initial aha moment that led to the research on psychological safety. And when I say people have differences, these differences were team-based, right? It wasn't just personality, like you might be different than me. Well, that's true, but that isn't what really shaped it. What shaped it was the what I called at the time, the interpersonal climate. So this care unit, this team, would just be remarkably different from that team, right across the hall in terms of their willingness to speak up about mistakes. Okay, well, that's interesting. Like, what's that all about? And, a short and incomplete answer is that it's about unit leadership, right? And like leadership in the middle, in this case, nurse managers or medical directors, right? It's those sort of proximal leaders that have an outsized impact on the climate that we develop together. I mean, we all have an impact, but the unit chair, the boss, the restaurant manager, they have a larger impact. And what the data showed was that these differences were very much, I get survey data from individuals, but individuals who are in the same team have very similar responses compared to individuals in another team. And particularly there was an item in that survey, that early survey, because again, this was a study of errors, so it was logical to include this item, which was, if you make a mistake in this unit, it's held against you, right? Like that lit up like a Christmas tree, right? It was just, this was sort of a oddly diagnostic item in marking differences across groups. And in also, it turns out later when we finally had the error data, it was the most predictive item of the actual reported error data. Like initially we were thinking of the error data, as if it came in from on high and was accurate. And then we had to kind of come to terms with the fact that these were not necessarily complete and full error data. They were reported errors, which is not the same thing as actual errors, right? Hello. So then that sort of started me, that accident started me down a path of saying, well, I wonder if this is true in other organizations, right? And when I say if this is true, I mean, are there meaningful differences across teams, even in the same organization? I got the chance to study a manufacturing company in the Midwest, one with a sort of a famously strong and positive organizational culture. So I figured this is going to be a tough test, right? Because everybody should be pretty good here. But indeed, again, profound statistically significant differences across teams. I had 51 teams in what I by then was measuring with a 7-item measure was psychological
And did you
safety.
call it that?
Well, not right off the bat. I mean, I was still thinking of it as interpersonal risk and interpersonal climate.
Yeah.
But in a manuscript review process in a journal, the reviewers said, "What you're talking about here is psychological safety," and I said, "Okay." I'm talking about psychological safety. I didn't know the term, and it had been used, but not very much in my field.
Yeah.
And but I called it. I mean, since I wasn't measuring individuals, I was measuring teams. I called it team psychological safety, or TPS, but that stands for the Toyota Production System, so I can't use that term.
I attribute you to the term psychological safety, and I know humbly you say, it's team psychological safety, but really it wasn't on the map.
Yeah. In the clinical world, like I think Carl Rogers may have first coined it. I'm not 100% sure of that. But Ed Schein and Warren Bennis used it in a book that they wrote together on organizational change to say people need this to be, able to change and help organizations change. So it's quite consistent. Actually, I hadn't read that book until this reviewer pointed it out, and then I did, and that was really interesting.
For those who want to hear more about this, because this is a fascinating topic, and I think it's foundational to the topic we're about to explore even more.
Totally.
Your book, The Fearless Organization, subtitle "Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth," is a must read. And then just as a side note, on R.O.G, we had Michael Bush, who's the CEO of Great Place to Work.
Yes.
Amazing leader and another role model. He shared that the predictive index for the greatest places to work, those who always win the Fortune 100 best places to work, he said that the one factor that is a sure thing, like you could see it from a mile away, is psychological safety. So
that's amazing.
So you're saying in order to have psychological safety, it's all about how we treat mistakes. So really, if we were going to look for what's the root cause of the greatest places to work, it's how do we handle mistakes?
That's fantastic. I hadn't heard that, and I have met him, and I think it makes sense to me, because I think we people, we humans, like to learn, right? And we want to be open and honest, but we kind of get the message that that's not so easy in many places.
Absolutely. And I know the question I want to close us with is, how can we thrive as fallible human beings? Because that's just the thing, is that we're fallible human beings. We're not perfect.
FHB.
Earlier you said that there's a difference between mistakes and failures. I think that would be an interesting place for us to start.
Yeah. So mistake means a deviation from a known process or practice or, way of doing something. That means we do have the knowledge we need to, we have a recipe. We make a mistake, we have deviated from it. I make a mistake and I fall off my bike, but ordinarily I'm pretty fine on my bike. Whereas a failure, failure is a bigger category. So mistake is a pretty precise thing. Failure is an undesired event or an undesired outcome. And some failures are indeed caused by mistakes, right? I make a mistake, I text and drive, I get into an accident. That is a failure caused by my mistake. But some failures are simply the undesired result of a thoughtful experiment in new territory. And those are the ones we must learn to love. I mean, I think we must learn to learn from all of them. Make no mistake. But the new failures are not mistakes because we had no recipe that we were deviating from. Right?
Yes.
We're trying to discover the recipe that we need to get the result that we want.
Excellent. So you explain in your book these 3 failure archetypes. Let's look at those, and then we can look at what is the criteria for the best kind of failure.
So I'll start just for fun with the good kind, right? Intelligent failures. Intelligent failures are the undesired result of a thoughtful foray into new territory, i.e. an experiment, right? And so scientists and inventors, lead athletes, celebrity chefs and others.
Parents.
Make their living. Parents, absolutely, through intelligent failures. They without intelligent failures, they cannot make progress into new territory. And I suppose that's true for parents too, right? Because every new year is a new territory. You've never had a 10-year-old before, or a 16-year-old before, and you will have deviations from happiness. There's no question about it. And we need to learn to kind of accept those with equanimity, learn from them. So those are intelligent failures. And just to be even more precise, there are 4 criteria. One is new territory. There is no way to look up the answer and then avoid the failure. It is in pursuit of a goal. You're not just messing about. You've got a hypothesis, right? You've done your homework enough to have good reason to believe this is worth trying. And number 4, the one that is so often missed in organizations, is no bigger than necessary, right? It's as small as possible. So you don't launch a new product without having tested it first with a smaller group of customers to see what they think. And let's say they hate it, then that's a failure, but it's a small failure and very few people have to know about it. And so those are intelligent failures. Basic failures are just that. They're the undesired results that are caused by deviation from best practice, generally a mistake. We make a mistake and we get a failure. Single cause. That's what makes them basic. Complex failures are multi-causal. They are the perfect storms. They are the failures that happen when a handful of factors come together in just the wrong way, where any one of the factors on its own would not produce the failure.
Really helpful. And so as we're experiencing failure, which inevitably we will throughout probably every day, it's helpful for us to run it through this criteria and to say, how do you think about that?
Yeah, well, so it's 2 things. One, I do think it's very important to kind of quickly size up, diagnose a failure, an undesired result that just happened. And for the following reason. First of all, if it's an intelligent failure, you can pat yourself on the back and say, thank you for the new information, right?
Yeah.
If it's a basic failure, you can say, okay, I wasn't, think about it. I wasn't paying attention. I was doing 2 things at once. I was walking down the street while texting and I, tripped on the sidewalk, right? Whatever it is, pause, remind yourself not to do that. In fact, a good portion of each of I have a chapter on basic failures, a chapter on complex failures, and the big portion of both those chapters is on best practices for preventing, right? Because this is really what you want to do. You want to prevent. There's not a whole lot of new knowledge that comes from a basic failure. So we want to prevent them. So yes, you diagnose it again for that reason, for that learning, and even for that self-congratulation if you've managed to have an intelligent failure and brought something new into your life or into your team. And secondly, because the framework is important because its primary goal is to help us avoid preventable failures while welcoming and probably increasing the production of intelligent failures. Mm-hmm. But in other words, take more risks. Like we have to be willing to take more risks in our life, in our work, risks that are appropriate, right? And again, no bigger than necessary to enable us to make progress.
Isn't she amazing? I'm so glad you're here to join me for this conversation. Let's kick it old school and talk about takeaway tips. R.O.G. takeaway tips, how to apply what we've learned to our own work and lives. Here are some things that we can practice. Be curious, like Buckminster Fuller modeled so well. Be willing to speak up about mistakes. We know that it's the basis for psychological safety, which is the basis for high-performance teams, which is the reason for the greatest places to work. So be willing to speak up about mistakes. Ask great questions like, how can I encourage our team to continuously learn and grow? How can we practice differently? How will I avoid unintelligent failure using the 4 criteria for failing well? Number 1, is this new territory? 2, is this an opportunity or in pursuit of a goal? 3, is it informed by prior knowledge? And 4, is it as small as possible? Please join us again next week for episode 192, when Amy shares about risk tolerance, uncertainty and preventability, the high road, power of questions, apologizing, and how to thrive as a fallible human being. Until then, stay generous, everyone.
Thanks for listening to R.O.G. Return on Generosity podcast. Please help us grow by subscribing and reviewing us on your favorite podcast player. And for more information, visit bridgebetween.com. We grow when we give.
우리는 나누면서 성숙합니다.
We grow when we give.
On rayonne quand on donne.
We grow when we give.